Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the invitation.
No worry.
I would like to thank the invitation. You can read the emails, Mariana's emails, if what my address is not so interesting. I'm not a specialist in the studies of careers, so I would not dare to speak about this topic specifically in an audience of specialists on career studies. And I will not also enter into the debate. I saw the document that Mariana sent me. I'll just put the time so that I can... I read the document that Mariana sent me, and the debate about the expansion of the concept of career, and what also could be the risks of the dissolution of this concept in terms of operative terms, and the debate on how this concept can in a way reenact the debates that are very classic in sociology between the agency and the structures, between the capacity of the subjects to act and or to be affected by the conditions in which they act. I'm in a way I like this Bourdieusian idea according to which an unknown law, and I know that when we talk about laws in social sciences it's polemic, but in Bourdieusian sense, in the sense of the probability of the structures. But he said, Bourdieu has this very known sentence where he says, an unknown law is a destiny, a nature. A known law is the possibility of freedom. So I subscribe this idea that if we want to explore the margins of freedom and to expand the field of possibility, it's very good to know what are the structures that constrain us. I will talk not about careers, but share some reflections on the way I look to the world of work, and perhaps from this sociological perspective, perhaps these elements can dialogue with your own reflections and the debates on careers you are having these days. First, an explanation on the title. My title, the title of this communication is Work is no longer what it never was. It's a provocation, of course. It's a kind of paradox. And in fact, it's the adaptation of a title of a French sociologist, Roger Cornu, that wrote in 1995 a chapter of a book called La classe ouvrière n'est plus ce qu'elle n'a jamais été. And this chapter...
Maybe translate to English.
No, it's the same. It's the same. It's the working class is not anymore what it never was. And I adapt this for work is not anymore what it never was. This idea he wanted to regard to the supposed unity and uniformity of working class dispositions in political terms, and he was questioning it was never uniform, it was never so homogeneous as we sometimes represent it. And in fact, in the dominant narrative in the social sciences and also in critical sociology, which sociology should be always critical, but it's very common that we identify a rupture. Till the 70s or the 80s of the 20th century, we had an industrial society, an organized capitalism, a relatively stable wage society, or in the French tradition, société salariale, a society where there was a compromise, a Fordist compromise with three main elements: labor law, collective relations, labor relations, collective bargaining, unionization, collective representation of workers and of employers, and thirdly, a welfare state, through which the decommodification of some rights transformed employment into a platform from which we could access to certain decommodified social rights or forms of indirect wage, the public services, education, health, social security, and so on. And it is supposed within this narrative that to this wage employment society, to this organized capitalism, would then have been followed by the moment we are still living, from the 70s, the 80s, where there was the end of permanent employment. There was the end of the hegemony of the open-ended permanent contracts in the Western capitalist societies that were the typical, the model, the most statistically relevant forms of employment. Supposedly the end of employment as a central identity anchor in favor of other anchors like consumption, cultural consumption, other ways, other affiliations. Supposedly the emergence of a biographical mode or model, Ulrich Beck, already, biographical model, okay, I will end, in Ulrich Beck's sense, whether this biographical model would be more reflexive, in a more optimistic view, or more based on the experience of the individual, in the negative individualism of which Robert Castel talks, or if you prefer, I saw there was also the reference to Zygmunt Bauman in the document Mariana said, the liquefaction of the solid institutions, and of course employment was one of these solid institutions of the solid modernity that was being liquidifying, and this liquid modernity based on enormous inequalities, based on mobility and enormous inequalities from this mobility between those to whom the world is irresistibly attractive, and they travel and they move because the world looks to them irresistibly attractive, and those that move because the world is to them unbearably inhospitable. And this is the difference that he talks about. The tourists, we would say, the nomads, the digital nomads, versus the vagabonds, or we would say the forced migrants, or the workers, refugees, and so on. And in this characterization, also the collapse of unionism, all this, this would be what would explain the time we are living. My point is that in everything, everything of these points, all these points contain a part of truth and a part of falsehood. And this portrait of this rupture is too simplistic for two reasons. First reason, because work in the past in Western capitalist societies, particularly in Europe, I'm talking particularly about Europe, whether in the first half of the 20th century or during the 30 glorious years after the Second World War, was never like sometimes we represent it. I mean, David Graeber, for example, in a text about the caring classes, he says, even in the days of Karl Marx and Charles Dickens, working class neighborhoods housed for working class neighborhoods in London had far more maids, bootblacks, dustmen, cooks, nurses, cabbies, school teachers, prostitutes, and costermongers than employees in coal mines, textile mills, or iron foundries. All the more so today. What we think of the archetypically women's work, looking after people, seeing their needs, explaining, reassuring, anticipating what the boss wants or is thinking, not to mention caring for, monitoring and maintaining plants, animals, machines, and other objects, accounts for a greater proportion of what working class people do when they are working than hammering, carving, hoisting, or harvesting things. I mean, even in those times, in a city like London, the idea that the industrial worker was the main work, and we are talking about the paid work, but edit the unpaid work, the work that makes the world exist, was never exactly as we portray it. Secondly, because also there have always been wide margins outside the so-called organized capitalism, the so-called société salariale, wage society, and so on. Just think of unpaid invisible work of women. Just think about the migrant work, the migrant workers that were outside this, for this compromise, that were outside labor law and its multiple protections. Or think of how much that society depended on other kinds of work, namely the work used in the production of raw materials in the colonized countries or ex-colonies that were still being politically expropriated through economic domination and so on. The second reason is not only because that portrait is not exact about what the work was in the past, but because also the description of the present that I was trying to make very sharp, very fastly, if it is made on the basis of an idea of total rupture, is also not accurate. First, industrial labor remains very important worldwide. It didn't disappear. It disappeared from the media representation, sociological research, political representations, but it is still growing in many regions of the world. Think about China, India, and so on. So what we have is a political and sociological invisibilization of industrial labor and of industrial working class, and dislocation of some of this industrial production to other regions of the world. And secondly, about this description of the present, work in the present is also not so liquid and temporary as we might think. If we look to the statistics of most of European countries, and I will talk more about Portugal, 80% of 75%, between 75 and 80% of the subordinated workers, the workers that have contract, have an open-ended contract, have a permanent contract. When we say temporary contracts represent 25, okay, this means that 75% of workers have a permanent contract. Thirdly, trade unions have not collapsed, even if they are very fragile. Even though union density has declined, collective bargaining coverage is still covering most of the workers with contracts and with permanent contracts. And for example, in Portugal, we had a general strike that revealed the political force of trade unionism. And there is, even if there is a decline in the inscription of workers in unions, workers have still a lot of institutional power inside the collective relations, working relations. This doesn't mean that there are no relevant structural, deep and rapid changes in the world of work. And of course there are, but I wanted to say that work is not anymore what it never was, in the sense that what we think it is and what we think it was, sometimes it's not so accurate. And of course there are changes, and these changes may have implications for the debate you are having on careers. I don't know whether they do, but you will tell me in the end. And I will speak about 6 changes, so then we can discuss it afterwards. First change, the changes within the so-called typical relationship of work, the typical wage-earning relationship, the typical open-end contracts. Many times we talk about precarization and the transformation and the changes outside this typical relation. But we should look also the changes inside, within this so-called modal typical relation. I'm talking about permanent contracts that have changes, for example, the growth of flexible working hours and flexible arrangements within the typical wage relation. The growth of shift work, not only in the industry, but in commerce, all kinds of services, accommodation, tourism, catering, and so on. The third change within the typical relation. Forms of insecurity resulting, for example, from making dismissals easier, but within the typical relation. We are discussing this now in Portugal because of a government proposition. Or the introduction of artificial intelligence, new technology, algorithmic management inside this typical relation. And these are increasingly transversal across professions, this algorithmic management, for example, or the introduction of artificial intelligence. So more than bombastic claims that AI will eliminate jobs, what they do, what is the transformation is they are transforming professions and the way jobs that exist and will exist are organized, often reducing autonomy, intensifying work rather than the opposite. As we can see, for example, in education, researchers and teachers, they are not disappearing, but we are changing the way we do these professions and our autonomy and so on. Second change, the so-called delaborization of labor relations. This goes beyond precariousness or precarization. It consists in replacing activities that were regulated by labor contracts with or by entrepreneurial legal forms and associating work with entrepreneurial identities and dispositions in Bourdieusian sense. An entrepreneurial habitus, if you want. What I'm talking about in the Portuguese case, and I assume maybe it's similar in other countries, similar mechanisms. I'm referring to three main forms. First, the independent work. Okay, it's a classical form of so-called autonomous work, formally self-employed. In practice, working for a company that does not recognize itself as an employer, but recognize itself as a client. It's not anymore, we don't have an employment, we have clients. We are not workers, we are autonomous workers that have clients. We are not workers with employers. This would be the classical way of entrepreneurialization of work. But there are also other legal figures in Portugal, such as the sole trader or sole entrepreneur, empresário em nome individual in Portuguese, if there are some people here, individual name entrepreneur, it's called like this, or the so-called empresa em nome individual, which should be in English empresa unipessoal, a sole person company, a company that you create and it's you. And these person companies of one person, sometimes with another person employed, they become very popular. For example, in the cultural sector, in the last statistics of the cultural sector in Portugal, in some areas of the cultural sector, the average person per company is 1.5 person per company, which means that we have a lot of one-person companies. And this happens, these figures of the one-person company, they are employer choices that prefer to have business relations with the worker, not labor relations, of course, because they will not pay social security and so on. But also for the workers, they are encouraged by tax regimes that are more attractive than the traditional self-employment, and that make people shift to these legal figures. And the labor relations become a relation between two companies. A company that is hiring and a solo person company that is making this activity. And this is what we have been calling the emprecariat, entreprecariat. Not the traditional precariat, but enterprises that are in fact real precarious workers. People that became entrepreneurialized. And it reaches a new stage with the Uberization of work. The task-based work, the no payment for availability time when it's connected to the application. We are waiting for the task to bring in the phone, and we are not being paid with this time. There are no contractual relationship with the platforms. No, the idea of what is the regime, the labor regime that applies. All the debate in European, not only European, in all the world, but about the European directive of the work on platforms, how to recognize the dependent work, the real dependent work that is being performed through this false independent work or this entrepreneurialized legal figures, as in Portugal and in many words. And precisely the debate usually is around whether these relations should be brought back under labor law and under the typical wage relation, even if there are specificities on how work is organized through algorithmic management and platformized work. Third changes, the challenge is brought in some sectors by information and communication technologies, computers and smartphones. I don't want to exaggerate the importance of telework, which exploded during the pandemics, but it is a fact, and I'm looking to the numbers in Portugal, but I know that it's same in many other countries. It is a fact that around 1/5 of the working class remained in telework. It's not majority, but 1/5, it's important. And it remained after the experience of the pandemics. Sometimes in hybrid, part of telework, part of presential work, and this will grow. The hybrid mode will grow, of course. It's concentrated in certain sectors. Some sectors, they cannot perform telework. It's not something that is general, but it's important and it's unavoidable in some sectors. On the other hand, we know how smartphones became real electronic collars, creating forms of addiction and so on. And in the labor sphere, all this debate of the economy of attention and so on. And in the labor sphere, what we have been observed is a culture of permanent availability, a culture of permanent connection, permanent connectivity, and this has a profound impact on labor relations. In 2023, there was a Eurofound survey where more than 80% of the respondents reported receiving work-related communications outside their contractual hours during a typical work week. So they were getting messages, emails and so on in the smartphone, in the computer, from the company, from their employer, from their supervisors, outside their time. We know this in the academic world and so on. So, and in this Eurofund report, almost 3/4 said that they were contacted by colleagues outside working hours every day. 67% were contacted by their superiors. The vast majority, 9 in 10 responded to these communications, with 1 in 4 responding to all calls and messages received outside working hours. This means two relevant phenomena are at play, and this phenomena could not occur where we had a physically delimited workplace, and where tasks could not we could not take home the tasks, namely through this kind of dispositives. The first is a confusion, a blurred boundaries between the workplace and the space of personal and family life, a certain dissolution of these boundaries. And the second is a confusion between working time and personal time, is the invasion and the colonization of our personal time by the demands of the employers or the colleagues through the smartphones and the emails. We take work everywhere because we are supposed to be permanent connected. And if you go to, for example, to these announcements of employment, sometimes they even say we want someone with this and this and this and permanent availability that is always available. And this is what the Alain Suppiot, before the smartphones culture, he talked about the ghosts, the specters, the phantasms of ubiquity. And this is the idea of the work is becoming ubiquitous, I don't know if ubiquitous. In Portugal, we can talk about this later. In Portugal, we created a law. I believe it is relatively unprecedented worldwide. This law was even mentioned in this show, this North American show, the Daily Show. Daily Show talked about the Portuguese labor law. It was, and the law is a law prohibiting employers from contacting workers outside working hours. Because the problem is not the right to disconnect. Of course, we have the right to disconnect already in the law. Is that we cannot exercise this right if we are connected. For us, for a worker, subordinate worker, to exercise this right, to realize this right, the point is not that he has a right, it's that the employer has the duty not to contact. It's not up to our responsibility to call, to answer or not to answer. We should not be contacted. This is the point of the Portuguese law. Forced transformation, the globalization, changes in global value chains and migration flows. In Portugal, this is very felt because maybe we feel it more strongly in recent years due to delocalizations of some production factories and products, because many young people in Portugal that are qualified by our universities, they emigrate, they go abroad to find some work, and because they are unable to find qualified jobs here, or because immigration has increased in an unprecedented way. Over 10 years, since 2015, in 2015 we had 200,000 immigrant workers. In 2025, 1,200,000. It multiplied to 6 in 10 years, and this means that there are changes in industry that involve not only how products are made but also where they are made. The scale of exploitation, subordination and subcontracting has increased in terms of geographically in the value chains, global value chains. There is a new international division of labor with expanded outsourcing, which will, I imagine, also have an impact on the way careers are conceived. And also, mobility in the field of work is increasing, either for reasons of choice. I was recurring to the metaphor of Bauman, the tourists, we would say digital nomads, the qualified professions that can move, that have international careers, and for reasons, this mobility increasing, for reasons that are not chosen and that force people to flee, the so-called migrants in flight, forced to move by the economy, by the climate changes, by the wars, and so on. And this means, and this is an important change. Fifth change, it's only 6. I'm almost in the end. Fifth change, and I will just point it, then we can discuss, is the climate change and the impact on work, the impact of climate change on work. Very briefly, some challenges. First, and this is being discussed in international labor conferences, the international labor organizations, and so on. It's how can we regulate work under extreme climatic conditions, which are becoming more and more frequent. In Portugal, we had disaster,
a
train of storms recently, and some questions were made on, and what about labor law in this case? Is what is the how it regulates this case? But not only this, we are talking about, for example, workers that work under 60 degrees in we use Celsius. But I don't know.
Celsius degrees.
So in a very hot estufas in the agriculture, or in the greenhouses in the southern Portugal, for example, or workers that work in extreme cold situations. And so this is one challenge. And the other, it's how to design a just transitional that is capable of closing fossil and highly polluting activities while guaranteeing decent employment, public services and economic democracy. And this, of course, needs for us to think about public investment programs, jobs for the climate, that are capable of articulating the defense of living and working conditions with the response to the climate crisis, overcoming the false opposition between labor rights and climate transition, and also rejecting the class biased and liberal responses that alienate the working class from this agenda of climate transition. In this case, of course, in my opinion, this path must be an eco-socialist program, but I will not elaborate further. And to end, sixth challenge, sixth change, the question of the collective voice. So because this transformation, of course, they pose significant challenges to collective action. In a report that was done by Jelle Visser for the International Labour Organization in 2020, Jelle Visser is a researcher on unionism, it's very well known. He says that he identifies 4 possible scenarios to the future of collective voice of work or of unionism. First scenario, he says, possible scenario, a scenario of gradual and general marginalization of trade unions. That is, declining unionization, disappearance of collective representation, and the predominance of an individualized logic in the relationship with work, with suffering at work, with regulation of work being lived as individual phenomena and being dealt with individually. It's in the end, just 2 minutes, if I can. A second scenario would be a scenario of dualization of the representation and trade union policies. So, unions increasingly concentrated in certain sectors of the world, of the world of work, and other sectors without any kind of representation. Third scenario, a scenario in which trade unions are replaced by other forms of social action and other forms of workers' representation that are not unions, such as movements of precarious workers, associations of self-employed or entrepreneurialized workers that are not unions, or, which is happening also in Portugal, corporate type of associations such as, I don't know if this would be understandable in different countries, orders, the so-called orders. Let's create an order for the socialists, an order of sociology, an order of sociology. It's psychologists, but these psychologists always had in Portugal. It's you know, it's a problem. One of the problems. No, but so it's the replacement of union representation by other forms, being more how to say, more movement type of representation, or corporate, I would say, conservative type of representation. And the last scenario, the scenario of a possible revitalization through the renewal of practice and the rejuvenation of membership. If you look to the Portuguese case, it is possible to identify all 4 tendencies, even if some are more dominant. And probably, if you look to your countries, you can identify these different tendencies. They are in presence, but they combine differently in each country. In Portugal, union density continues to decline. We have in the private sector around 7% of union membership, and particularly in large companies. At the same time, growing sectors of the world of work, there are growing sectors of the world of work where trade unions struggle to gain a foothold and try to make a connection. For example, in platform work, in agriculture dominated by migrant labor, segments of tourism and catering that are marked by informality. And in this sector, it's very hard for unions to intervene. It's very hard for them to represent workers, because these workers are informal, are entrepreneurialized, are in the so-called false independent workers, and so on. But also there is a creation or renewed prominence of older associations or new associations that are gaining prominence in the representation of workers. For example, migrants associations that are not unions, but they are the ones that take the agenda of migrant workers to the public sphere. Or, for example, many young people in the demonstrations of the 25th of April with working related banners and so on, individually done, artisanalistic done, not done by themselves with their own hands, and it's very beautiful to see that. Or, for example, a partial reawakening of the cooperative movement among youth. And finally, some trade unions with practices that are attentive to what is new, such as trying to recruit platform workers, migrant care workers, combining wage demands with others. For example, this week in Portugal, the union of the service sector fought against the fact that a company that is very big company in Portugal of the distribution sector, logistics sector, Sonai Logistic, prevented workers in a logistics warehouse from speaking Creole with each other. And the union made a campaign for the right of workers among each other, not with the client or with the boss or the chief, the supervisor, but among each other, the right for them to speak Creole, that is their language. or we could say other language. And this is an example, very recent from this week example, of unions incorporating an anti-racist struggle and a struggle for autonomy in working place inside the union agenda. So, without being exhaustive, this I think gives some ideas of some aspects that are changing, and also some aspects of what is permanent and remains, and between this the miserable present that we sometimes have, and the possibilities, the richness of the possibilities, we will find some paths that I hope they are interesting and emancipatory, and we can discuss this. Thank you very much.
I think it would be a waste of an amazing talk if we didn't give you time for questions. So I think we were thought-provoked enough for several of you to have some comments, some questions for our keynote speaker. Oh my God. You are still processing this amount of information. But overall, I think that it touched numerous issues. Well, with the first keynote speaker, although it was not arranged between keynote speakers, and also amongst many of the discussions we've been having in our sessions, right? Around critical awareness, empowerment, disempowerment, or epistemic justice, social justice, individuals. In the session that we just finished here in this room, we were talking about the need of collective action, bringing the collective again to the forefront of our work as people in the career field, but not just as citizens of a very complex society that it's very hard to read, and how to think about ways of helping those that somehow, because they have Creole as their native first language. And there's a very specific community of migrants in Portugal from Cape Verde, which officially speaks Portuguese, but their first language is actually Creole. And I'm assuming that's the kind of work that you were referring to. So for them, what is natural is to speak Creole, not Portuguese. They only start speaking Portuguese when they go to school, because then the education system is in Portuguese. But still, Creole is what they speak with their families at home.
It was what happened with Portuguese migrants in France.
Yes,
They were speaking Portuguese among them. It's normal. It's normal. It's common. It's.
Yeah. So,
I have a question. Let me try to help. Hi, thanks very much. I really enjoyed your talk. So really appreciated it. So I was really interested in your sort of public policy and international perspectives, and that's my understanding. Is you've got, even though you're sociologists, you're a politician as well. If I understood correctly from
I've
Philip,
been
if
in
I
the
was listening
parliament for
properly.
10 years, yes.
Yeah.
But not now.
Yeah.
Not now in parliament.
So, and I noticed, well, you referred to the ILO a few times, and so this is a speculative question, but my understanding is that the ILO has lost probably about a quarter of its funding because of the withdrawal of United States monies, and there's speculation that then potentially China will come in and actually be potentially funding or contributing to, filling that gap, really. I mean, this is speculative, but this is what I've heard. So I'm interested in whether you've got any insights or any thoughts on, because the ILO have been really important in doing the research and establishing these aspirational processes, but potentially they're under threat.
If you could make some more questions to allow me to think on this one.
So I really enjoyed as well your talk, and I'm just wondering. Fiona. If you could elaborate a little, Thaisa, if you could elaborate a bit more on the eco-socialism program, because we've been talking about taking change, but then changing for what? So I think that's the first time in the conference today that maybe we can offer from some alternative concretely. So I just would like to hear more you on that.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I thought it was really, really great, and I wanted you to say a little bit more about these sort of alternative forms of collective organisation that you were discussing, like the migrants' associations or the precarious workers' associations, because it seems to me that inevitably those kinds of organisations have to either become unions or to build some kind of close relationship with unions, because otherwise they remain as a kind of peripheral actor, and so they have to be able to engage on the industrial level and in terms of negotiation and so on. So I mean, I think it's really exciting, but I sometimes people get very excited about these sort of new social movements and say, well, the unions are over, we've got now new social movements, and it seems to me like really the opposite is true, that you need to pull these things into that kind of world and use them to enrich unionisation.
Sorry, I just had one. My question was more or less in the same line as Tristram's, but was how a service that often is kind of atomized or individualized, like careers guidance, exists in an individualized conversation between two people, can plug into the collective institutions that you were talking about, because that does seem to me to be extremely important in kind of contesting the trends that you were outlining so eloquently. Thank you.
Okay. So I don't have inside information about what is happening with ILO. No, but it's a big change in geopolitical change and in the so-called world order that was not so orderly built. There was many inequalities. Of course, the international law was never fully respected. But what is happening is, in a way, the collapse of this of the idea that there is an international law that vinculates the. I'm sorry, I will say Portuguese words in English accent, and maybe they don't exist, but that would imply the countries and also these international organizations. And of course, I understand why the far right and a person like Trump and an administration like them doesn't like ILO. Of course, ILO, it's a tripartite organization, but it's an organization that was founded with the idea that without justice there's no peace, with the idea that labor is not a commodity. And these two very ideas, they seem today radical ideas where they were the consensus of the post First World War in a moment, and post Second World War. And it's bizarre that we live in times where this very supposed to be common sense ideas, work is not a commodity, workers are not a commodity, and we should have a certain kind of regulation of work that is not the same of the capitalist world of commodities, and the idea that peace is based on justice and not on the imposition of force. These two ideas are totally in crisis because of the way how international politics evolved. So I don't know what would be the future of ILO. I don't say that we don't need to rethink the organization, the international organizations. Also, there is a huge debate on the ONU, United Nations organization. That is, we have a Portuguese as a general secretary. But these institutions are still institutions that bring some balance and bring some agendas that now become more and more how to say, counter-hegemonic. If you see what the António Guterres is saying about the Palestine or about the war, it's totally counter-hegemonic in institutions that were supposed to be part of the hegemonic order of the world. So I don't have I don't have, but I think it's still very interesting what is being put in the agenda of ILO, even if it is an institution that has to deal with the balances of different countries, different economic interests, and employers, workers, and states. But there, I think it's still a very important international institution. About eco-socialism, so I'm not a specialist in eco-socialism, but I think some ideas could be brought. First, I think we need to think about a post-capitalist world. I don't think that capitalism is the end of civilization. It can be the end of civilization because it can destroy the planet, but it's not necessarily the last stage of human development. I see eco-socialism as first a program based on the idea that economy should be submitted to democratic decision. First, the idea that the question is not to grow, it's where we should grow and where we should degrow. So the question is not in abstract terms, let's grow or let's degrowth, less growth or let's degrowth, but what are the sectors that should be eliminated? For example, the sectors based on fuel, carbon, and so on. And what are the sectors that we must amplify? And also in terms of the world, how can we think about production in terms of the different regions of the world where we should degrowth and the regions where we should growth, and in what sectors? And in this thought about economy and economic planification, to think about jobs for climate, to think about public services, to think about public transports, to think about a transition that would respect labor rights and have an economic plan of investment that would combine labor rights of the people that belong to the sectors that we want to disappear, that they disappear, and keep these rights, combining them with social justice and with a planification of production that would meet human needs that are democratically decided. And the idea of course of the decommodification, the growing decommodification of growing parts of our social life and of our economy. I think, and also of course eco-socialism is a critique of capitalist mode of production, but also a critique of the extractivist and productivist versions of socialism, or supposed alternatives to capitalism that were based also on production that was extractivist and an economy that was extractivist and productivist. So very briefly, but there are many there are many authors that I can reference, John Bellamy Foster, Michael Ovy, and many others. The alternatives forms of collective organization, I totally agree that the question is, it's not that unions will be replaced by these forms of collective organization, but how unions can be transformed by these forms of collective organization. And what is the productive dialogue and combination and inspiration and fertilization of these forms of collective action to transform and to rejuvenate and to revivify the union movement. This means that unions should be more open to a dialogue with these forms of organizations. I will tell you a short story. I'm very close to the platform workers movements here in Portugal and all these dynamics. And there was a platform worker that knocked the door of a union, a classic union in Portugal, and he asked if he could join the union. And the guy in the union, and I know this guy, he's a nice guy, a generous unionist and so on, and he said that he could not join because for him to join he would need to define what would be the union membership, the amount of the union, the union fee, and because he didn't have a contract, and because he didn't have this revenue, he could not calculate, how to say? Calculate the union fee. You know, so unions must be open to new kind of contractual arrangements. There was also a debate on the idea, a debate on. There is also international debate, of course, and many experiences of unions that accept independent workers, unions that accept entrepreneurialized workers, even if they are fighting for them to be recognized as subordinate workers or workers with traditional, let's say, contracts. But they accept even if they are not yet in this kind of contractual arrangements. This is very important that that unions are open to it. Also with the migrants, I think there is in many countries much more than in Portugal, but in Portugal also there is a growing consciousness of unions that they need to incorporate we cannot discuss the world of work without combining the labor laws with the migrant laws, with the migration laws, with the nationality laws, because the regime of accumulation, of capitalist accumulation in Portugal and in other countries, the labor regimes are made of the combination of labor laws and different migration status and different and the classist access to nationality. So there is not an agenda for the emancipation of work without the combination of the dimension of the labor law and the dimension of the migration status and the nationality laws. This must be combined. And I think there is a growing consciousness of unions about this, or the small examples as I gave, that a question as the languages that workers can talk is also a question for unions, as the gender issues, the fight against sexual harassment, or the fight for time to care. The fight for a national care system is also a matter for unions. I will end. And from the point of view of the movements, I also see that there is, if you want to engage in the collective labor relations, you must of course you must first find forms of continuity. One of the difficulties of the social movements of precarious workers, migrant workers, and so on, is finding ways of continuity, of inscribing in a duration, in a time duration their action. And this is the old question of transforming a movement into an institution, a democratic institution, an institution that is open to change, that is not bureaucratized. But movements, if they want to have this continuity and intervene in the collective bargaining, intervening in the labor rights, they must find ways of becoming institutions, both by joining already existent institutions and transforming them, joining unions, transforming unions, or creating their own institutions that can represent these workers. For example, in some countries there are institutions representing independent workers that are real independent workers. For example, designers that are not subordinate workers, or other forms, or other workers that in fact they are real, they really work as independent workers, but they need their own ways of representation. That is not liquid representation. We must find our own ways of having solid institutions to fight a capitalism that wants us disorganized. And I think we must find our ways of organizing and organization. And how can career guidance relates with this? This is a question for you, not for me. You know that, I don't know, but I think you would know how to answer. Thank you very much.
So I would very much like to thank our speaker, José Soeiro. I hope you find it very interesting and thought-provoking, as I said initially. I think we now have to move very quickly to the next session. Marianne and I already arranged kind of like some flexibility in terms of the end time, additional 15 minutes, before lunch for
We'll
the next
work that out.
session.
Don't worry.
Okay, so that everyone can have equal amount of time and is not, is not, also discussion time is possible. And then what we'll do is that we'll slightly shorten, okay, Tristan, the roundtable in the afternoon to compensate with these delays, okay? So we want to ensure that our next session, everyone also has enough time to